14 tons of cedar, left to gray in the rain, dumped and forgotten. She filled one bag, lifted it, and the smell told her everything. The mill manager arrived with a clipboard and a disposal fee. She said 4 words. "The farm is not for sale." The coffee had gone cold an hour before she noticed it. Maggie Holloway stood at the kitchen table in the olive-green canvas jacket she'd worn to the burial, one hand flat on the brass-cornered cedar journal, the other hanging open at her side. And she didn't sit down. Sitting felt like agreeing to something. Outside, the November rain came sideways across 60 acres of thin Oregon ground, and every one of those acres belonged to her now, along with everything owed on them. 23 years old, her grandfather 3 days dead. A hay stand that had gone patchy and pale 2 summers running because the topsoil on that ridge was maybe 4 inches deep before you hit gravel and old volcanic grit, and no amount of praying fixed gravel. She opened the drawer under the counter and pulled out the folder Eli kept his papers in. $9,400 on the tractor note. Property taxes past due $180. A feed bill at the co-op that had been rolling forward since March, and a hay crop that had brought in $1,100 total that year, on ground the county assessor had described, in a typed line she'd read 4 times, as marginal. That's the whole inheritance. Debt and gravel. She turned back to the journal. Cedar boards for covers, corners bound in brass he'd hammered flat himself, pages soft as cloth from 40 years of thumbs. Eli Holloway had been a cedar man before he was ever a hay man. He'd built shake roofs, fence rails, chicken coops, blanket chests, and he'd done it with a cedar-handled draw knife he carried in his left hand, the way other men carry a hat. She could still see him on the porch, stooped forward, weight on the left leg, white mustache moving while he talked to wood that hadn't answered him yet. Halfway through the journal, in pencil gone soft and gray, one line sat by itself on a page. Waste is just a failure of imagination. He'd written it in 1954, and then written it again in 1971. Same hand, shakier. Underneath the second one, he'd added, "Nobody ever got rich buying what everybody wanted." Maggie put the journal in her right jacket pocket, where it lived, and went to town. Ruth Vance ran the dry goods store on the corner, and she came around the counter with her arms crossed at her chest the way she always did, gold reading glasses swinging on their beaded chain. She'd known Eli 40 years. She'd brought a ham to the house on Sunday and hadn't said much then. "You want it plain?" Ruth said. "Yes, ma'am." "Sell the lower 40. Wexler's boy would give you $900 an acre for pasture, and that clears the tractor and the taxes both. Keep the house and the top 20, and you can breathe." She uncrossed her arms, put a hand on the counter. "Your grandfather was a fine man, and he was stubborn. And one of those 2 things is what's got you standing here." Maggie looked at the wall of nail bins for a moment. "I'll think on it," she said. She didn't, but she said it kindly. 9 days later, a car she didn't recognize came up the gravel, and out stepped the mill. Dale Merrick, operations manager, Cascade Ridge Mill, 12 miles down the highway. Charcoal suit jacket over a pressed white shirt, no tie, polished black dress shoes that were about to learn something about Oregon in November. Thin silver-rimmed glasses.
He stood military straight with his hands folded over an aluminum clipboard with a pen chained to it, and he looked past her at the house and the barn and the sagging fence line. And he smiled, the way a man smiles at a dog that's done a trick. "Miss Holloway, I'll be brief. I know you've got—" He glanced at the mud. "Things." He had a problem, though he called it an opportunity.
The mill ran cedar, and cedar planing throws off shavings by the ton. And the landfill in the county had just raised its tipping rate. Merrick needed somewhere to put waste that wasn't a landfill. So he'd pay her $75 a load to store it on her back lot. 6 loads a week, maybe more in season. 14 tons a week of planer shavings, curled and dry and smelling like a closet in a good house. "It's a favor, really," he said. "Frankly, this is charity dressed as a contract. There's no market for this material. None. People smarter than you and me have looked." He let the pen swing on its little chain. "You'll take it, of course. Look around." She did look around. She looked at her own barn. Then he said the part he'd said before to other people, in that patient, pleasant voice, the one that costs nothing and takes everything. "Sweetheart, girls like you don't run farms like this. You run them into the ground, and then you sell them to somebody who can. I'm just making sure you eat while it happens." That was the moment she stopped being polite in her head. She didn't argue. She never would. Maggie asked to see the contract, took it inside, and sat down at the same table with the journal and read all 4 pages twice with a pencil in her hand. Then she came back out into the drizzle with 2 lines added in her own writing. "Materials title," she said. "Anything unloaded on my ground becomes my property at the moment it leaves the truck. And you don't get to come take it back." Merrick actually laughed. He held the clipboard against his chest, water beading on the aluminum, and laughed at her. "You want title to garbage. Those are my terms." He signed it. Of course he signed it. A man who thinks he's handed you an anchor doesn't read the rope. He initialed both lines without reading them properly, tore off her copy, and walked back to the car, scraping mud off his polished shoes on the running board. Have you ever agreed to something everybody watching was sure would ruin you? The trucks came Thursday, 6 of them, staggered through the afternoon, backing down onto the lower lot with their beds tilting up and the load sliding out in a long, pale rush. Cedar shavings piling into a mound taller than the barn door, steaming faintly in the cold. 14 tons. Maggie walked out into the rain in her boots and her canvas jacket, braid heavy and soaking down her back, and stood beside the pile while the last truck pulled away. The rain came down steady and cold, the kind that soaks a canvas jacket through in 20 minutes and doesn't apologize. Maggie stood at the edge of the mound, with her braid darkening against her back, the auburn gone almost black with water, and she pushed both hands into the shavings up to her wrists. Warm. Not warm like a stove. Warm like something alive. Like a compost heap already deciding what it wanted to be. That surprised her. She dug deeper, past the wet crust, and the heat rose around her forearms, and with it came a smell that stopped her breathing for a second. Cedar. Not the faint ghost of it you get off a fence post. Concentrated, sharp and sweet and old. The smell of a closet in a house where somebody's great-grandmother kept her winter wool. She went to the barn and came back with a burlap feed sack, and she filled it by hand, packing it down. And when she hoisted it onto her shoulder, the oil hit her full in the face, released by the pressure, by the crushing, by her own grip. 50 pounds of what Dale Merrick paid $75 a load to make disappear. That's the moment. Right there, in the rain, with a wet sack on her shoulder. No plan, no buyer, no idea what she was doing. She just knew that smell was worth something, and that a mill full of educated men had been paying to bury it. Here's what she figured out over the next 2 hours. On her knees in the mud, with a pile of shavings sorted into 2 heaps, like a woman going through a dead man's mail. The pile wasn't one thing, it was 2. Half of it was pale, almost white, cream-colored, light as breakfast cereal, and she held a handful to her nose and got nothing. Wet wood, damp paper. The smell of a lumberyard in general, and no lumber in particular. Sapwood, the outer rings, the young living part of the tree that carries water up the trunk, and it carries no oil at all worth naming. The other half was red, deep pinkish red going toward purple where it had been shaved thin, and one pinch between her fingers filled the whole barn doorway with scent. Heartwood, the dead center of the tree, the part the cedar closes off and fills with resin and oil so nothing can rot it from the inside. That's what she was smelling. That's what moths hate. The tree makes it to defend a corpse, its own dead core, and it works so well that people have been storing wedding dresses in it for 400 years. So the sorting mattered. Sapwood was packing material. Heartwood was product. And nobody at the mill had ever bothered to keep them separate, because to the mill, both of them were the same thing. Garbage they had to pay to haul. Then she found the second problem, and this one nearly cost her the whole first delivery. She dug into the outside face of the mound, the part that had been sitting in Kentucky rain for 2 days since the trucks tipped it. Red shavings, right color. She lifted them to her face. Nothing. Flat, dead as sawdust. She went in 6 inches, still weak. 8 inches, and it came back, faint. A foot in, the oil hit her again full strength. Rain leaches it. The aromatic oil isn't locked in like a mineral. It's volatile and it moves, and water running through a loose pile carries it straight down into her lower lot where it does absolutely no good for anybody. Every hour that mound sat uncovered, the outer 6 inches turned into expensive mulch. She had maybe 60 tons coming, and she was watching it drain away into the mud. So she quit standing there. The pallets were behind the tobacco barn. 30 some of them Eli had stacked and never used, gray and splintered and perfectly good. She dragged them out in the rain and laid them flat in a rough rectangle 40 feet by 20, off the ground so air could move underneath, because a pile sitting on wet dirt wicks water up from below and rots from the bottom. Then the tarps. 2 big silage tarps from the loft, patched at the grommets with baling wire. And she cut locust poles and set them as a ridge so the water would shed off instead of pooling and tearing through.
Then she hauled. Wheelbarrow, shovel. 30 loads before dark. Red heartwood shavings out of the wet outer skin and into the dry crib. One barrow at a time up a plank ramp she'd nailed together from a busted stall door. Her shoulders went to fire around load 12. She kept going. Her hands split open across the base of both thumbs, and she wrapped them in electrical tape and kept going. Cars slowed on the county road. They always do. 3 of them that first afternoon, then 5 the next day, easing down to 15 miles an hour so the driver could get a proper look at the 23-year-old woman moving a mountain of sawdust in the rain with a wheelbarrow. Buddy Chalmers said it first, over coffee at Ruth Vance's dry goods counter, loud enough that 4 people heard it and 40 people repeated it. Holloway's got herself a mountain of nothing. Old man leaves her 60 acres and she fills it with the mill's trash. Guess it runs in the blood. Ruth, arms crossed at her chest, gold reading glasses down on the beaded chain, didn't say a word. She just rang him up and gave him his change and looked at him a half-second longer than she needed to. Maggie heard about it. She didn't answer it. She hauled 30 more barrows.
That night, she sat at the kitchen table with her boots off and her hands taped. And she took the flat, brass-cornered notebook out of her right jacket pocket and went hunting through her grandfather's handwriting for the word cedar. She found it on a page dated March 1961. Cut cedar for Della's chest. Sapwood is nothing, throw it to the stove. The red heart is where the tree keeps its medicine. Oil in the heart is what turns the moth. Keep it dry. Rain steals the smell, and once it's gone, the wood is only wood. Folks throw out the heart because it costs work to find it. Waste is just a failure of imagination. She read it 3 times. The last line she read out loud, alone, in a cold kitchen. Then she uncapped his pen, turned to the next blank page, and wrote her own first line beneath his. Day 1. Sorted red from white. The red still smells. 60 tons coming. Morning came, and with it the first real problem. She had the wood. What she didn't have was a product. On the kitchen table she laid out a bread knife with a nick in the blade, a hand-crank coffee grinder bolted to the table edge, and 3 canning jars packed with cedar at 3 different grinds. Coarse curls in the first, like wood shavings off a lathe. Medium chip in the second. In the third, something closer to flour. She unscrewed the coarse jar and put her nose over it. Sharp, clean. Good for about a day, and she knew it, because she'd cut those curls 2 days back, and now they smelled like nothing but dry attic. Big shavings hold their oil deep inside the piece. The scent lives in the cut surface, and a fat curl doesn't have enough cut surface to matter. It goes flat, fast. So she went the other way. Cranked the grinder until her right shoulder burned, and she had a jar of dust so fine it hung in the light coming through the window. That one smelled incredible. It also failed worse. She sewed a test bag out of a scrap of white cotton pillowcase, filled it with the fine stuff, and left it on a folded dish towel overnight. In the morning, the towel had a rust-brown stain the size of a saucer, and the bag itself was weeping oil through the weave like a bad tea bag. Cedar oil isn't a perfume.
It's a resin. Grind it to powder and you've got a bag of pigment. She wrote it down. Fine dust. Stains. Coarse. Dies in 48 hours. Middle somewhere. The fabric was its own education, and she paid for it in ruined scraps. Cheesecloth she tried first because it was cheap and Ruth Vance sold it by the yard. Cheesecloth bled. The weave was so open that chips worked their way out the corners, and she'd find a trail of cedar across the floor, like something had sprung a leak. Canvas held everything, absolutely everything, including the smell. She stitched a canvas sachet, sealed it, and 3 days later put it to her face and got fabric and nothing else. Too tight. The oil had nowhere to go. A sachet that doesn't breathe is just a beanbag. Unbleached muslin was the answer, and it took her 9 tries to find it. Plain weave, roughly 68 by 68 threads to the inch. Soft, undyed, cheap as anything. Tight enough to hold an 1/8-inch chip. Open enough that the volatile oil could walk right out of it and into a wool coat. She held a square up to the kitchen window and could see the light through it in a fine grid, and something in her chest settled. Then came the sorting, and this is where her grandfather started talking to her again through her own hands. Not all of that cedar was equal. The pale outer sapwood barely smelled at all. Soft, blonde, worthless. The heartwood was the red stuff, dark as old brick, and that's where the oil lived. Eli had written it down in the cedar journal in that cramped pencil scrawl, and now she was proving it, one board at a time. She learned to sort by color first and smell second. Red goes in the good pile. Blonde goes in the stove. For the grade, she built a screen.
Took a window frame out of the barn loft, tore out the old bug mesh, and stapled in hardware cloth. 1/4-inch grid on the top, and under it a second frame with window screen, the fine stuff. Cedar goes in the top, gets shaken. Anything bigger than a 1/4-inch stays behind and goes back to the grinder. Anything that falls all the way through the fine screen is dust and gets swept off into a coffee can. What sits in the middle layer is what she wanted. Uniform chip, roughly 1/8 of an inch. Enough cut surface to throw scent for months. Not so fine, it turns into stain. It took her an afternoon to build. It saved her 4 years. Then the sewing. Squares of muslin, 4 inches by 4, hemmed on 3 sides, filled with a scant 1/4 cup of chip, folded and stitched shut by hand with heavy cotton thread. She timed herself with the kitchen clock. 4 minutes a bag once she got the rhythm. 15 an hour. And out in the yard sat somewhere north of 14 tons of cedar, waiting on her. Do that math sometime, at a kitchen table, alone, at 11 at night. It doesn't comfort you. She sewed 50 anyway. Ruth Vance came out to the truck when Maggie pulled up in front of the dry goods store with a crate on the seat. Ruth crossed her arms at the chest the way she always did, the gold wire rims sliding down, and looked at the crate the way you'd look at a possum in a churn. "Honey," she said it kindly, which somehow made it worse. "Who on God's green earth is going to pay money for a bag of garbage?" It was the gentlest insult Maggie took all year, and it still landed. She didn't argue. That's the thing about her, and if you've been paying attention, you already know it. Maggie Holloway had gray-green eyes and a square-set jaw and a habit of standing very still while people talked, hands hanging open at her sides, the brass corner of the Cedar journal showing at her jacket pocket. She let Ruth finish. Then she reached into the crate, took out one sachet, and held it out. "For your wool drawer," she said. "Free." Ruth took it because it was easier than not taking it. 3 weeks. That's what Maggie asked for. 3 weeks, and then Ruth could throw it out and never mention it again. Ruth said fine, mostly to end the conversation, and dropped it in with her winter cardigans that afternoon, and forgot about it by supper. 12 of the 50 went on the counter at Vance Dry Goods, in a shallow apple basket beside the register, with a piece of cardboard that read, "Cedar, for wool and linen. $1.25 in Maggie's blocky pencil letters. Ruth agreed to it on consignment, 60-40, and made a face like she was doing charity. The rest went back home in the crate and sat on the porch boards in the cold, 50-12, smelling like a forest, waiting on somebody to be wrong. 3 weeks later, Ruth Vance pulled open the wool drawer behind her counter and stood very still. Not because something was wrong, because nothing was. Every winter she lost skeins to moth, little gray larvae working through the merino, leaving holes the size of a pencil eraser and a fine dust at the bottom of the drawer that she'd been sweeping out for 31 years. She ran her freckled forearm through the yarn, turned over 4 skeins, 5, 6, clean. She adjusted the gold wire rim glasses on their beaded chain and looked at the flat muslin sachet lying in the corner of the drawer, the one she'd tossed in there mostly to be polite. 12 sachets went on the counter on a Tuesday. 9 days later, there were none. Farm women bought them 2 at a time and came back for 4. A man who'd never bought anything in that store but nails and chewing tobacco bought 3 for his wife's cedar chest, then came back and bought 2 more for his truck. Ruth wrote the reorder on the pad in her apron pocket in pencil, tore it off, and handed it over with her arms crossed at the chest, the way she stood when she'd made up her mind about something. 40. She wanted 40. Maggie read the slip standing on the store's plank floor, the loose auburn strands at her temples still damp from the walk over, and said one word. "All right." Then she went home and worked until 2 in the morning. Here's the part nobody in Colbert County knew was happening, because it happened in a cold shed with a kerosene lamp and no audience. Maggie didn't trust a good week. She wanted proof. So she built herself an experiment out of 2 shipping boxes, a roll of packing tape, and $30 of raw wool she couldn't really spare. 2 sealed boxes, same wool, split by weight, 11 ounces each. Same shed, same corner, same temperature swing. Into one box, she put 4 ounces of her cedar grind, the coarse fraction, the stuff that still smelled like the inside of a fence post when you crushed it. Into the other, she put nothing at all. Then she introduced the same thing into both, a scrap of infested wool from the back of Ruth's storeroom, the one Ruth had been about to burn. 60 days. She wrote the start date in the Cedar journal in her right jacket pocket, in her own hand now, below her grandfather's.
and she checked the boxes every 10 days with a flashlight and a pair of tweezers. Day 10, both boxes had activity. Day 20, the control box had more. Day 40, the control box was a nursery. She counted 19 larvae and stopped counting. The cedar box had 2, both dead, both curled at the seam furthest from the shavings. Day 60, she wrote the number that mattered. The thujaplicins in eastern red cedar heartwood don't kill on contact so much as they refuse to let the larvae feed and molt. Fresh grind, high volatile oil. Aged, weathered, sun-bleached mill waste. The stuff the mill paid $75 a load to bury held less oil in the sapwood and plenty in the heart, which is exactly why she'd been splitting every stick and grinding only the red core. She'd been right by instinct. Now she was right on paper. Which is about when the charcoal gray suit jacket came back up her gravel drive. Dale Merrick got out with the aluminum clipboard held across his belt buckle, military straight, chin lifted, silver-rimmed glasses catching the light. He looked at the 11 remaining crates of cedar waste stacked and tarped along the fence line. He looked at the shed with the grinder. He did the arithmetic behind those hazel eyes, and he smiled. And that smile was worse than anything he could have said. "Miss Holloway, I hear you found a little cottage use for our scrap." Hour. 15 months after he dumped it and called it a favor. "The mill's prepared to take the material back off your hands. All of it. No charge to you. We'll bring the flatbed, save you the eyesore." He clicked the chained pen. "Frankly, it's a courtesy. You've got what? A sewing hobby and a hand grinder? Sweetheart, this is industrial fiber. You don't have the capital, you don't have the equipment, and you don't have the education to run a supply chain. Let the adults handle the adult work." He said it the way a man says a weather report. Maggie stood square-shouldered in the olive canvas jacket, hands hanging open at her sides, the birthmark below her ear pale in the cold that had already reddened her cheekbones. She let the silence go long enough to be uncomfortable, which it was, for exactly one of them. "The title says it's mine, signed by your company. I'll keep it." Merrick's jaw moved once. He wrote something on the clipboard that didn't need writing, got back in the sedan, and left ruts in her gravel. The 40 sachets got made. So did the 80 after that, and the 120 after that. And somewhere in there, the hand grinder stopped being a tool and started being a wall. 6 hours of cranking produced maybe 11 pounds of usable grind, and 11 pounds was 3 days of orders. Her right shoulder went from sore to numb to something that woke her up at night.
So she went looking in the barn loft, where her grandfather never threw anything away, and came down with a 1940s hand-cranked cream separator, the bowl gone, the frame and gear train intact. She stripped it, kept the crank and the reduction gears, and built a drum out of 1/4-inch hardware cloth wrapped on a wooden axle. Feed the rough grind in the top, turn the crank. The fines drop through into a canvas chute, and the chunks tumble out the low end to go back through the mill. 41 pounds in 6 hours. Same shoulder, 4 times the yield. Then February came with a 5-day rain, and one tarp seam on the north stack lifted maybe 2 inches in the wind, and water went in and stayed in. Dawn. Maggie stood in the mud in the scuffed brown boots with water running off her braid, pulling back sodden tarp, lifting handfuls of grated stock that came apart wet and gray and smelled like nothing at all. Leached. The oil rinsed clean out of it. 2 tons. $400 of finished product gone into the ground. She counted it twice, standing there in the wet. A tarp wasn't a roof. That was the whole problem, and she knew it before she'd finished counting. By noon that same day, she was out on the back lot with a ball of baling twine, walking it off heel to toe. 24 feet one way, 32 the other. She drove a stake at each corner with the flat of an axe head and stood in the middle of that rectangle with her hands hanging open at her sides, auburn braid down her back, the wind pushing loose strands across the pale thumbprint birthmark below her ear. 2 tons of ruined shavings behind her, black with rot, worth exactly nothing. And she's measuring out a building. That's the whole woman right there. The bank in Corbin was happy to help. Of course they were. A loan officer with a laminated rate sheet slid a folder across the desk and offered her $6,000 for equipment. A metal-sided pole barn kit, a mechanical dryer, delivery in 3 weeks. 12%, 5 years, secured against the 80 acres. Maggie read every line. Then she pushed it back. "I'll build it myself," she said. "Those are my terms." The man laughed the way men laugh when they think the joke's already over. Here's what $6,000 would have bought her. A machine that runs on propane and somebody else's schedule, and a lien on the only piece of dirt Eli Holloway ever managed to hold on to. She walked out with the folder still on his desk. The lumber came from the old tobacco barn on the Piner place, the one that had been falling in on itself since before she was born. $80 to the widow for the right to take it down, and 3 weeks of Maggie on a ladder with a wrecking bar, pulling square-cut nails out of chestnut and oak that had been seasoning in open air for 70 years. Wood like that doesn't exist anymore. She stacked it by length in the yard. She built the shed on locust posts set 2 feet deep, no concrete, because Eli's journal said concrete traps water, and locust doesn't rot, it just gets harder. And she built it wrong on purpose. No walls. That's the part nobody understood. The shed had a roof and 4 corner posts and open gable ends at both peaks, and the long sides were nothing but slatted racks, 6 tiers high, boards spaced an inch apart so air could walk right through the middle of the building and out the other side. Curing cedar isn't drying it in an oven. Heat drives the oil off with the water. What she wanted was moving air, shade, and time. The moisture leaving slow while the cedarwood oil stayed put in the fiber. Every 4 days she turned the racks by hand. Bottom tray to top, top to bottom, raked the shavings level with a wooden hay fork so no pocket packed down and went sour. 4 days, every rack, all summer. Her hands cracked at the knuckles and she taped them and kept turning. She had a scale and a little tin oven she'd rigged from a canning pot.
Weigh 100 grams of shavings green. Bake it dry. Weigh again. The difference is water. Green stock off the mill ran 42% moisture. After 9 days on the racks, 18. After 26, 5. And then came the thing she wasn't expecting. She'd been selling small, a few sacks of green shavings to a kennel over in Whitley, some to Ruth Vance to set out by the register at the dry goods store.
The green stuff worked fine. But when she put a handful of the 5% cured shavings in a paper sack and squeezed it, the smell came up out of the bag and hit her in the back of the throat. Sharp, almost medicinal. Nothing like the soft, sweet nothing the green stock gave off. Because the water had left and the oil hadn't. Same amount of cedarwood oil, half the mass to carry it in. Concentrated. A pound of cured stock threw more scent than 3 pounds green, held it 4 times as long, and didn't mold in a closed sack because there was no water in it to feed anything. She'd been selling water. For 2 years, she'd been hauling water to market and wondering why nobody came back for a second bag. Small noise. A tarp seam leaking in December. Catastrophic failure? Every single sack she had ever sold was wrong, and she'd blamed the market for it. That's the pivot. She wrote it in the Cedar Journal on the last blank page of Eli's handwriting, in her own, underneath his. Now, the bad night. Late September, rain coming down so hard on the tin it sounded like gravel poured off a truck. Kitchen table, 1 bulb. The ledger opened to a column that ended at $211.40. Property tax due in January, 160 of it. The loan papers were still on the table because she'd gone back and gotten them, and she'd been sitting there long enough that the coffee had a skin on it. $6,000 solves November. Everybody knows that. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Not a little of it. Everything. The roof, the tax bill, the way people say your name at the feed store. And then sat alone at midnight with the easy way out lying face up in front of you, already signed on the bank's side, needing nothing but your hand. She opened the journal instead. Found the page from 61, the draw knife shaving still stuck in the gutter of the spine. Waste is just a failure of imagination. Then she put on the olive canvas jacket and walked out into it. The shed was 70 yards from the house, and she didn't take a light. Rain sheeting off the gable ends, wind moving straight through the open peaks the way she'd built it to. Inside, dry as August. She put her hand flat into the top rack, down into the shavings, and they were warm. Not hot, not composting, just holding the day's heat the way dry cedar does. The smell came up around her in the dark, sharp enough to sting. 2 tons had rotted under a tarp. Not 1 ounce had rotted under a roof. She stood there with her hand buried in it until her arm went numb. Then she went back in, folded the loan papers in half, and set them under the stove to start Tuesday's fire. The shed was finished, and what came out of it that fall smelled stronger than anything the pile had ever given her. The rented sedan came up the gravel on a Tuesday in April, moving slow the way a car moves when the driver isn't sure she's at the right place. Beige 4-door, rental sticker in the window. On the passenger seat, face up, a mail-order catalog with a photograph of a farmhouse kitchen on the cover and the words Hearth and Hollow printed across the top in a font somebody paid good money to design. The woman who got out was named Carol Denny, and she'd driven 90 miles from the airport in Lexington on the strength of a paper bag. Here's how that happened.
Ruth Vance had been selling Maggie's cedar sachets off a wire rack by her register for 11 months. 4 for $1.50, and a woman passing through on her way to a funeral in Hazard bought a handful and stuck them in her suitcase. 2 months later, that suitcase came out in Portland, smelling like a mountain. The Portland woman was Carol Denny's sister. Carol called Ruth's store from a number printed on the little muslin tag, because Maggie, being Maggie, had written the store's phone number on every single one in pencil.
Ruth gave her directions and then hung up and stood there with her arms crossed at her chest, gold wire rims sliding down her nose, and said out loud to an empty store, "Well, hell." Maggie came out of the drying shed with sawdust on her jacket sleeves and her auburn braid pulled forward over one shoulder. Gray-green eyes, the birthmark below her left ear catching the light. She didn't wipe her hands before she shook. Carol talked for a while. She talked about her catalog the way people talk about weather they own. 9 states, spring and fall editions, a mailing list of 200,000 homes, an average order of $31. She said the word sourcing about 6 times. She said she'd been looking for a domestic cedar product for 2 seasons, and everything she'd found was Chinese-milled sawdust in a printed pouch, and it smelled like a pencil factory. Then she picked up a handful of shavings off a shed floor, held them to her face, and got quiet. That's the sound of somebody doing math. Have you ever had one stranger walk onto your property and tell you the thing everybody laughed at is worth more than your house? Because that's the moment. 2 years of being the Holloway girl who hauled other people's garbage, and the woman in a rental car standing in it, breathing it in, saying, "How much of this do you have?" Maggie told her. 14 tons, roughly, cured and screened and stacked under roof. Carol asked her to say it again. Now. Carol Denny wasn't the enemy. She was a buyer, and buyers try things. She floated the idea gently, the way they do. Her catalog had its own house label, private label, cleaner presentation. Maggie's name wouldn't appear anywhere, but the checks would be steady, and Maggie wouldn't have to think about anything but shoveling. Maggie stood there with her hands hanging open at her sides. "My label," she said. "My grade standard. And I'll need a receipt for everything." 3 sentences, closed like a door. Carol blinked, and then, credit where it's due, she laughed and said fine. She'd learn over the next decade that arguing with that woman was like arguing with a fence post about the wind. The grade standard was the part that mattered, and Maggie had already written it in Eli's Cedar Journal on a page dated the previous November. Heartwood only, no bark, no sapwood. Screened through 1/4-inch hardware cloth to pull the fines. Cured under roof a minimum of 90 days, never in direct sun, because sun cooks off the oil, and what you're selling is the oil. Any batch that didn't punch you in the nose from arm's length got dumped back on the pile. That's the whole business. The old man's line, in his handwriting, 3 pages earlier. Waste is just a failure of imagination. She'd read it so many times the ink was going soft under her thumb. Now do the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is obscene. 14 tons is 28,000 pounds. At 5 ounces a sachet, that's roughly 90,000 units. Carol's catalog would carry them at $6.50 a pair. Maggie's wholesale, after 4 rounds of Carol trying to shave it and Maggie not moving, landed at $1.90 a unit. 90,000 times 190.
The mockery pile. The mill's trash. The stuff Dale Merrick had been paying $75 a load to haul to the landfill before this little gal took it off his hands for free, was sitting in that shed as inventory worth 6 figures. Let that sit with you.
Merrick's exact words, 2 years back. Aluminum clipboard folded under his arms, silver-rimmed glasses catching the sun. Honey, you're hauling off garbage. There's nothing in it. There's nothing in you people out on that ridge. You just don't know when to quit and go get a real job. He billed disposal on that same material for 11 years. Never once smelled it. Maggie needed hands. She drove to Ruth's store and Ruth put a card in the window, and inside 4 days she had 3 women sitting at her kitchen table. Loretta Pike, who'd sewn at the shirt plant in Jackson before it closed, and her cousin Dinah, and a widow named Verna Coyle, who could hem faster than anybody alive. $4.10 an hour, cash, on the books, with a receipt book, because Maggie kept receipts on everything, including herself. That was the first paid work on the Holloway place in 10 years. The last person Eli had ever put money in the hand of was a man who helped him drop a walnut in 1974. Loretta cried a little in her truck afterward. Didn't mention it. Nobody did. The contract came by mail on the 9th of May. 2 pages, carbon copy behind it. 4,000 sachets, delivered to a warehouse in Portland by the 15th of September. First real deadline of Maggie's life. She read it twice at the kitchen table, signed it with Eli's stub pencil, and put the carbon on a nail in the wall, right beside the Cedar journal, hanging open on its cord, the old man's handwriting facing out into the room. Then she went and started counting muslin. 3 sewing machines running in the converted hay barn, and cedar dust hanging in the light like something in a church. 2 hired women from town at the treadles, Maggie at the grading table, her braid down her back, sleeves shoved up over her forearms. The muslin came in on rolls now. The shavings came in by the bushel basket, red and curled and sharp enough in the nose to make your eyes water if you leaned in wrong. 4,000 sachets by September. They made it, boxed them, taped them, put them on a freight truck out of Barrows Crossing on the 4th, and Maggie stood in the gravel and watched the taillights go, and felt something in her chest she didn't have a word for. 6 weeks later, 300 came back. Not a note at first, just a pallet on her turnaround with a return authorization slip stapled to the shrink wrap. Then the phone call. The buyer was polite about it, which was worse. Customers said they smelled like nothing, like a dry sock, like sawdust. She cut one open on the kitchen table under the hanging bulb and put her face down into it, and she knew before the shaving hit her nose. Nothing. Wood. Dead wood. Here's the chemistry nobody told her, because nobody knew it but the tree. Eastern red cedar carries its aromatic oil, the cedrol, the cedrine, locked inside heartwood cells. Fresh off the saw, that wood is holding 30–40% moisture, and water sits on top of oil like a lid. Bag it wet, and the moisture has nowhere to go. It stays in the muslin. It goes soft. The oil never migrates to the surface where a nose can find it, and given 6 weeks in a sealed carton, mold spores start doing arithmetic you don't want done. The August batch had been rushed. She'd bagged 11 days off the saw because the truck was coming. She sat at that table a long time. The journal was on the wall on its nail beside the framed contract, and she didn't open it,
because she already knew what page it would be. Wood tells you when it's ready. You don't tell it. The fix took her 11 days to design and the rest of her life to never break.
She built drying racks, 4 of them, 8 feet by 4, hardware cloth stretched on cedar frames, stacked with 6 inches of airspace between, set in the loft of the hay barn where the summer heat pooled and the ridge vent pulled a draft. Shavings went on 2 inches deep, no more. 21 days minimum. Every rack got a tag, cut date, load number, source pile. She kept a cure log and a composition book, date, ambient temperature, humidity off a $1.50 dial hygrometer nailed to the post, and she raked each rack by hand every 3rd day so the bottom layer got its turn at the air. And then, the test jar. This is the part the industry later stole from her wholesale. She'd pull a scoop from each rack at day 19, seal it in a pint mason jar, leave it 4 hours in a closed room. Open it. Nose it cold. If the oil came up out of that jar and hit you in the sinuses like a slap, the rack shipped. If it came up soft, it went back on the frame for a week. Nothing scientific about a woman sniffing a jar, except it was. She was measuring vapor phase saturation with the only instrument she could afford, and it was accurate to within a day. The replacement 300 went out in October at her own cost, and she put a printed card in every one. Cured 21 days, cut date on the back. That card sold more cedar than any salesman ever born, because the buyer, who had been ready to walk, read it out loud to his merchandising manager, and the merchandising manager put it in a catalog line, and by February, the sachets were in 91 stores across 9 states and selling out inside 11 days of each drop. Reorders came in by phone, and then by mail, and then faster than she could grade. 2,000, 3,500. A 5,000-unit standing monthly from a Nashville chain that had laughed her out of a lobby the year before. And that's when she hit the wall that no amount of work fixes. She was out of wood. Not out of scrap, out of the right wood. Sapwood, the pale outer ring, has almost no oil in it. Mixed mill scrap runs 60% sapwood and bark and pine contamination. Every bushel she picked through, she was throwing away 2/3. Her pile behind the barn, the pile that had been a mountain, the pile the whole county had watched her build like a crazy woman, was down to a knuckle of red in a sea of gray. She needed heartwood, sorted, dry, by the ton. There was exactly one place in 3 counties that produced it. Now here's the part I've been waiting to tell you. While Maggie was building racks in a hayloft, the Barrows Crossing Mill was quietly bleeding out on the other side of the ridge, and nobody there had noticed yet, because they were too busy congratulating themselves. Dale Merrick had spent 4 years paying a hauler $75 a load to burn cedar waste in an open pile behind the yard. 40 loads a month. $3,000. Gone up as smoke every single month to get rid of the exact material Maggie Holloway was hauling off for free and turning into $11 a unit retail. Then the state got interested in open burning. New permit rules, spring of that year. No uncontrolled burns over 2 cubic yards without a filed emissions plan and a monitored enclosure. The mill's number came to $58,000 for an incinerator they'd need to run and maintain and inspect. Or they could landfill it at tipping fees that penciled out worse. The man who had stood in her yard with his clipboard and told her, in that patient tone people use on animals, "Honey, you're welcome to the trash. That's all it is. That's all you'll ever get out of it."
Now he was doing math. He came up the lane on a Tuesday in April in the charcoal jacket and the polished shoes, and for the first time since she'd known him, his hands were empty. No aluminum, no chained pen. He'd left it in the truck like a man taking off his hat. She let him in. She poured coffee. She sat.
"Miss Holloway," he said, and cleared his throat. "Would you take the whole Heartwood stream?" She let him finish. Then she poured him coffee he didn't drink and said 4 words. "I'll need a contract." He got one, on her terms, not his, sorted at the mill, red heartwood only, no sapwood, no bark, loaded into her own trailers, straight off the No. 2 conveyor. That's the picture you need in your head now. Shavings and short blocks the color of dried blood coming down the belt, and instead of dropping into the burn hopper the way they had for 30 years, they hit a chute Maggie paid a welder $80 to fabricate and slid into a trailer with Holloway Cedar stenciled on the side in white paint she'd brushed on herself with a 2-inch sash brush. 40 tons a year. That's what came off that belt and up her gravel road once the thing hit full run. 40 tons of what a mill had been paying $75 a load to burn. And here's the part that ought to make you laugh out loud. Within 2 years, the grading standard she'd scratched into the back of a feed store notepad, heart red, tight ring, under 12% moisture, no knot larger than a dime within 4 inches of an edge, got quoted back at her. Not by her, by buyers. A furniture shop in North Carolina wrote a purchase order asking for Holloway grade or equivalent. 2 mills in the next county started sorting to it because their customers demanded it. A woman who'd been mocked for stacking rot in a shed had accidentally written the rule book, and the mills that laughed were now grading their scrap against her name. Nobody voted on it. That's not how standards happen. Somebody just does the work right for long enough that everyone else has to catch up or shut up. The neighbors came in the order these things always come. First, the whispers stopped. Then came the grudging silence. Men at the co-op who used to snort into their coffee now just nodded at the top of her braid when she walked past. Dark auburn, loose strands at the temples. Same as always. Then came the first one, hat in hand. Carl Denton, who'd told half the county she was burning her grandfather's memory on a rot pile, drove up with a flatbed of cedar fence culls and stood in her yard, turning his cap over in his hands. He didn't apologize. None of them did. Not one word of sorry in the whole damn county. What he said was, "I got about a ton of this. You buy it?" And Maggie Holloway, hands hanging open at her sides the way they did, said, "40 a ton. Delivered, if it's dry." He stuck out his hand. She shook it. That's the apology. In that country, an apology is a handshake and a changed practice. And Carl Denton never burned a cedar cull again as long as he lived. After Carl, it was 6 others inside a year. Then, it was everybody. Men who'd bulldozed cedar into brush piles started stacking it on pallets under tin roofs because the small woman up the hollow would pay cash money for it if it dried right. She taught them the moisture rule. She taught them the ring count. She didn't gloat, didn't remind anybody what they'd said, didn't lord 1 single inch of it over 1 single one of them. Silence is a hell of a weapon when your ledger's doing the talking. Ruth Vance's dry goods store became the regional pickup point because Ruth had a loading dock, a scale, and a stubborn streak the size of a barn. Growers and cutters from 4 counties dropped bundles there Tuesdays and Fridays. Ruth weighed every one, wrote the ticket, and pushed her gold wire rim reading glasses up on the beaded chain to squint at the numbers. She wore the same canvas apron she'd worn for 30 years.
except now the pencil in the pocket had Holloway Cedar Company printed down the side in green ink, and she was upright and arms crossed behind that counter like a woman guarding a bank vault. "Ordered 500 of 'em," Ruth said once, tapping the pencil on the scale.
Figured I'd hand 'em out till somebody asks what it means. Everybody already knew what it meant. Third spring, Maggie drove to the bank in Hazard and did 2 things in 1 hour. She bought the lower 40 back outright. The 40 Eli lost when the note went bad. The 40 she'd watched a stranger's cattle chew for 9 years. Cash on the barrelhead, $31,400. And she paid off what was left of Eli Holloway's debt to the dollar. Not settled, not negotiated down. Paid. $11,206.40, because she was not going to let 1 dime of the old man's name stay owed to anybody. She asked for a receipt. She always asks for a receipt. Then she drove home, walked the fence line of the lower 40 with the brass-cornered Cedar Journal in her right jacket pocket, and didn't say a word to a living soul about it. Now, Dale Merrick. You want the dramatic ending, the confrontation, the man in the charcoal suit begging, the silver-rimmed glasses fogging up while she reads him a list of everything he ever said to her. The, "You're a girl playing farmer, honey," and the, "Sweetheart, the mill doesn't need your permission," and the, "You'll be selling this place inside 18 months. They always do." You don't get it. Nobody got it. What happened to Dale Merrick is so much worse than a speech. He became irrelevant. The Heartwood stream she'd built stopped being a favor he could grant and started being a contract he had to honor. The disposal fee he used to hold over her head was gone. She'd deleted it from his budget. He had no leverage, no product, no pitch. A man whose entire power was having something you needed, standing in front of a woman who needed nothing from him at all. He transferred to a mill in Tennessee in the fall, left a forwarding address at the post office. The aluminum clipboard went with him, and I bet money the pen was still chained to it. Nobody at the mill mentioned him again. That winter, Maggie sat at the kitchen table with the Cedar Journal open under the lamp, past Eli's last entry, into the blank back pages. She started her own record there. Same cramped block print, same short lines. Moisture readings, tonnage, weather, what failed and why. Because the man wrote it down for her, and somebody was going to need it after. Third page in, a knock on the shed door. A young woman from 2 counties over, boots muddy, asking how the drying racks were spaced. Maggie handed her a pencil. The pencil is a stub, sharpened with a knife the way Eli sharpened his. That's how it starts. And 31 years later, that same young woman's daughter's generation is standing in the same shed, and Maggie is still handing out pencils. Walk the back lot with her now. She's 74. The braid is silver, still one thick braid down her back, still loose strands at the temples that never learned to stay. Same olive green canvas jacket, not the same coat, the 4th one, maybe the 5th, but she buys the identical cut from the identical catalog
because she solved that problem once and doesn't intend to solve it again. Brass-cornered notebook in the right pocket. Always. The ground under her boots is black. Not dark brown. Black. The way river bottom is black. And it goes down 11 inches before it fades to the old gray clay that used to be the whole story of this hill. That's where the pile leached for 4 decades, where the tannin water and the shavings and the fines soaked through and rebuilt a slope that in 1979 grew nothing but broom sedge and spite. She crouches, takes a handful, works it between her thumb and forefinger. It crumbles into pellets. Worms come out of the divot, annoyed at the light. Above her, the cedar windbreak Eli planted the winter before he died stands 40 feet tall and cuts the north wind down to a rumor. He set those whips out at 4-foot spacing with a dibble bar and a bad hip, and everybody told him he'd never see shade from them.
He didn't. That was never the point. The sheds still smell like 1979. Cedar, hot metal, tannin, and the sweet rot of green shavings. A smell so specific that people who worked here as kids can be blindfolded in a parking lot 2 states over and name it. The apprentice this year is 22, from the next valley over, and she has the same problem every one of them has. She wants a meter. "There's a moisture meter in the drawer," Maggie says. "Use it if it makes you feel better. Then check it with your nose." She teaches the grade by smell test the way it was taught to her. Break the stave over your knee, put the fresh face under your nose, and breathe in slow. Greenwood smells like a wet dog and a sugar bowl. Sap still moving, still feeding something. Middle cure smells flat, like paper in a hot attic. And that's the one that fools people, because it looks perfect. And it isn't. Right cure smells faintly of pipe tobacco and old bourbon and dust. And the second you smell it, you stop asking questions. The apprentice gets it wrong 11 times. On the 12th, she goes very still and says, "Oh." That's the whole lesson. Nobody's ever said it better. Numbers, decades on, because the numbers are the spine of this thing. The product ships to 9 states. 410,000 board feet of stabilized barrel stave stock moved through this yard last year alone, off a scrap stream that a mill used to pay $75 a load to burn. That burn pile hasn't been lit since the spring of 1983. Not once. The mill's cooperage waste, every cracked stave, every headliner offcut, every barrel that failed pressure test, comes down the county road on a flatbed every Tuesday, and Maggie pays 11 cents a board foot for it. And the mill's accountants call it a revenue line now instead of a disposal cost. 14 small shops in 3 counties buy her cure stock. 2 of them are run by men who used to stand in Ruth Vance's store and laugh about the crazy girl stacking garbage on a dead man's hill. Ruth is gone. Passed in 96, upright and arms crossed to the end. Gold wire rims on the beaded chain. She left Maggie the canvas apron with the pencil still in the pocket. It hangs on a nail by the shed door, and nobody wears it. Dale Merrick. Remember him? Silver-rimmed glasses, aluminum clipboard, that patient little smile he used like a scalpel. The man who stood on this exact lot in a charcoal gray suit jacket and told a 23-year-old woman, "Sweetheart, this is scrap. You are scrap adjacent."
Sign the release and let the grown-ups handle the waste stream. He never got a comeuppance scene. No shouting, no ruined man in the rain. He just got transferred to a regional office in 1988, then retired, and the operations manager who replaced him inherited a contract with Maggie Holloway's name on it, and no memory of why it was ever controversial. That's the ending he earned. Not defeat. Irrelevance. The system he spoke for simply stopped needing him, and the world he sneered at now buys its stock from the hill he wanted cleared. Nobody who works that mill today can tell you what his face looked like. They can all tell you what her sheds smell like. Last October, the Regional Woodworkers Guild gave her an award at a hotel conference room in Lexington with bad coffee and 140 folding chairs. They wanted 20 minutes. She stood up, hands hanging open at her sides, square-shouldered and still. My grandfather couldn't get anybody to take this seriously. I just kept stacking. The wood was never the problem. Thank you. 4 sentences. Then she sat down. The room stayed quiet a beat too long, the way rooms do when they've been handed something heavier than they expected. And then it came apart in applause, and she was already looking at her boots. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea nobody would even argue with you about, because arguing would mean taking you seriously? Now, in the shed. February.
The apprentice has cure log number 9 open on the bench. 41 years of columns in 3 different hands. Eli's, Maggie's, and now a third. Maggie sets the brass-cornered cedar journal on the bench. Then the draw knife, cedar handle worn to a shine on the left side where a stooped man's grip lived for 50 years. She puts both into the young woman's hands and closes her fingers over them. "You'll finish what I didn't," she says. "That's the job. Waste is just a failure of imagination." Outside, the windbreak leans in the wind and holds. The black ground goes on down the hill. Somewhere south of here, another mill is paying to burn something. Go look at what your county throws away.